He never expected that helping someone would turn his world upside down. One late night, under the quiet glow of streetlights, a man stepped forward when everyone else turned away. He saved a life that once looked down on him, judged him, and treated him like he didn't belong. But instead of gratitude, what followed was fear, suspicion, and a shocking accusation that spread like wildfire. In a society where prejudice decides who's a hero and who's a threat, what happens when the truth threatens power? And how far will they go to silence him? Before the night that changed everything, Aaron Miller lived a quiet, simple life, the kind that rarely drew attention and never made headlines. He was the kind of man who believed the world still rewarded kindness, that good deeds eventually found their way back. He worked hard, kept to himself, and always tried to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. But the truth is, sometimes doing the right thing is exactly what puts a target on your back. Every morning, Aaron woke up before the sun rose, the soft chime of his cheap alarm clock filling his small apartment. His routine was nearly identical each day: a quick shower, a modest breakfast, and a 20-minute walk to the bus stop where he'd catch a ride downtown for his job as a building maintenance assistant. It wasn't glamorous work, but he'd built a reputation for reliability. When something needed fixing, Aaron was the one people trusted to get it done right. He took pride in being helpful, in making others' lives just a little bit easier. The neighborhood he lived in wasn't perfect. The sidewalks were cracked, the buildings weathered, and on some evenings, distant sounds reminded everyone that safety here was never guaranteed. But to Aaron it was home, full of people who laughed loudly, helped each other when they could, and understood the struggle of making a life out of very little. He enjoyed the small joys, greeting neighbors from his balcony, grabbing coffee from the friendly corner shop owner, giving a few dollars to the man who always played blues guitar by the bus stop. He didn't have much family left, not after his mother passed and his brother moved across the country to chase bigger dreams. But he had what he needed: a decent job, a few close friends, a roof over his head, a heart that wanted to believe in humanity. And yet, Aaron knew the world didn't always see him the way he saw himself. He was a black man in a society that often judged him first and understood him later, if at all. He'd learned to keep his voice calm, his movements careful, his presence unthreatening. He knew which stores watched him closely when he browsed too long. He knew the looks people gave him in nicer neighborhoods, the unspoken suspicion, the polite distance. He knew how quickly fear could replace gratitude, how thin the line was between being seen as a citizen and being treated like a threat. But Aaron never let that turn him bitter. He chose to stay hopeful, even when hope felt foolish. His job took him into wealthy buildings where he saw a different world: polished floors, expensive suits, and people who never wondered whether they were welcome. One building in particular stood out: a towering office owned by one of the city's most powerful corporate firms. And inside that tower worked a CEO whose name everyone knew: Victoria Hale. She was a woman of influence, sharp, commanding, respected. Her face appeared on magazine covers. Her voice filled boardrooms and news broadcasts. She built her success from nothing, and she wanted everyone to know it. But success changes people, or maybe it just exposes who they've always been. Victoria noticed everything, except the people she didn't think mattered. For her, Aaron was invisible, just part of the building, like the lights or the elevators. She rarely looked at him long enough to register his name. On the rare occasions she did acknowledge him, her eyes carried a chilling message: don't get too comfortable. And yet whenever she walked past, Aaron would nod politely, because kindness was who he was. There were moments, small cutting moments, when Aaron felt the sting of her prejudice. A purse clutched tighter. An elevator door held just long enough to close in front of him. Security glances that followed him down hallways he'd cleaned dozens of times. It wasn't loud, it wasn't blatant, but it was constant. Still, Aaron pushed forward. He believed that respect was earned with patience. That change took time. But change doesn't always arrive the way we expect it. As autumn rolled in and nights began stretching longer, the city seemed more restless. Streetlights flickered earlier, and the cold wind chased people indoors more quickly than before. Aaron didn't mind the quiet. It made his evening walks feel peaceful, like the world finally slowed down enough for him to breathe. He often stopped by to help elderly neighbors carry groceries or check on the broken fence behind the community center. Every small act was his way of pushing back against a society that tried to shrink him. He wanted to leave a mark, not one carved by anger, but by compassion. He didn't know it yet, But compassion would soon put him in the center of the kind of story he had only ever witnessed from a distance. A story where someone like him wasn't celebrated as a hero, but targeted as a suspect. One Friday evening, the office building had been unusually tense. Rumors whispered among employees that Victoria's empire was on the edge, a deal falling apart, investors pulling out, a scandal forming like a storm cloud ready to pour. She had spent the entire day pacing through halls, phone glued to her ear, barking orders that echoed off marble walls. Aaron passed her once, tools in hand, heading to repair a malfunctioning light panel. She paused just long enough to glance at his uniform, an expression of annoyance crossing her face, as if the presence of someone ordinary only worsened her day. He didn't take it to heart. He nodded and continued working, unaware that life was about to place him in her path again, in a much darker moment. When his shift ended around 11:40 p.m., Aaron stepped out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, a few cars passed, leaving trails of light reflecting off wet pavement. He zipped his jacket, shoved his hands into his pockets, and began the usual walk toward the bus stop. His mind drifted, thinking about the weekend, the chores waiting at home, and whether he'd finally find time to fix the shelf he'd been putting off for months. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. As he crossed an empty intersection, he noticed a sleek car swerving slightly in the distance. He paused for a moment, eyes following as it slowed near the curb, door swinging open, someone stumbling out. The figure gripped the roof of the car, trying, and failing, to steady themselves. High heels clacked unevenly against cement. A purse slipped from their shoulder and tumbled to the ground. Even from afar, he recognized the rigid posture, the perfectly styled hair now falling out of place. Victoria Hale. The CEO who wouldn't even hold a door for him was now barely able to stand. The street around her was deserted, no drivers waiting, no friends stepping out to help her. The car that brought her there took off before she could even call out. She tried to walk, but her legs gave out beneath her. She fell to her knees, breath heaving, hands scraping the concrete. The woman who commanded boardrooms now looked small, fragile, terrified. Aaron froze. He could walk away. He could pretend he saw nothing. He could let karma handle whatever this was. But that wasn't who he was. So he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, making sure not to startle her. He didn't know that the moment he made that choice, the moment he decided to help, his life aligned with hers in a way that would change everything. A decision that should have made him a hero would instead make him a target. Because some people don't want to be saved by someone they look down on. Some people would rather rewrite the truth than admit who really had the power. And in the hours that followed, the lines between gratitude and accusation would blur, twisted by fear, entitlement, and prejudice. Aaron had no way of knowing that helping her would ignite a chain reaction, that his name would soon be whispered with suspicion. Those eyes would turn against him, so that his kindness would be used as fuel to destroy him. For now, all he saw was a person in need. For now, all he did was offer help. But the world wasn't watching a Good Samaritan story unfold. It was preparing a fight for his dignity, his future, his freedom. A fight he never asked for. A fight that would prove just how easily society decides who deserves to be believed, and who can be blamed without question. Because in the wrong eyes, a savior can be mistaken for a villain. And Aaron was about to learn just how dangerous it is to be the hero when you don't look like one. Aaron approached slowly, his footsteps measured, his breath visible in the cold night air. The street was still, too quiet. The kind of calm that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. For a moment, he hoped Victoria would notice him as he approached and accept the help. But nothing about this situation would be simple. As he moved closer, her eyes widened, pupils frantic, unfocused from alcohol, fear twisting every blink. Her breath was ragged, uneven, desperate. The powerful CEO who commanded respect with a single glance was reduced to panic and confusion. She didn't see a good man trying to help. She saw a stranger approaching in the darkness, a stranger with the wrong skin color. Her instincts didn't weigh his kindness, or his past of quiet service, or the fact that he was the only one willing to step in when others had abandoned her. Her instincts saw only a threat. Aaron raised his hand slowly, trying to make himself smaller, non-threatening, a survival instinct carved from years of navigating a world that judged him before hearing him. The thought crossed him, sharp as a blade, this could go wrong. But he ignored it. Someone needed help. And helping was what he did. He bent down to retrieve her fallen purse, placing it near her hand. She tried to move, but nearly collapsed again. He offered his arm so she could steady herself. His only intention was to make sure she didn't get hurt. But the look in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was an alarm. Her breathing grew quicker. Her body leaned away even as he helped her stand. Her fear was growing faster than her balance. His touch, meant to support, only amplified it. The icy silence of the street was shattered with a metallic crash, a trash bin pushed over at the corner by a late-night stray animal. The sudden noise jolted Victoria. Her legs buckled again, but this time she pushed away from Aaron, limbs scrambling, fear taking control. She stumbled backwards, and her ankle twisted before she hit the cold pavement again. The moment felt like a camera flash in Aaron's mind, a decision point. Walk away now, or double down to help. His heart ached with the weight of responsibility. He couldn't leave her like this. So he reached for her again, the instinctive act of a good man trying to prevent harm. He didn't know that this brief contact would become the spark for a fire meant to engulf his life. In her panic, Victoria cried out, loud, sharp, full of terror. Not the terror of injury, but the terror of misconception. The sound echoed off buildings like an alarm. Windows lit up. Someone peeked through the curtains. A neighbor stepped onto a balcony, squinting at the scene below. Now the story wasn't just between her and him anymore. Now there were witnesses, distant observers who saw only a drunk woman on the ground, and a black man leaning over her in the shadows. Judgment formed instantly and silently. Victoria tried to stand again, but collapsed against his chest. Her hands clutched his jacket not out of trust but out of desperation, and that physical closeness, uninvited by both, became the perfect image for the wrong conclusion. Aaron's voice trembled in his own head, though he spoke no words. Please, understand I'm helping. But the world rarely waited for explanations. A phone light came on across the street, recording. More curtains parted. A voice yelled something he couldn't hear clearly, but the tone stung with accusations. Fear wrapped cold fingers around Aaron's heart. He needed to call someone, medical help maybe, but the phone in his pocket suddenly felt like a loaded weapon. Reaching for anything too fast could turn suspicion into danger. He looked around for help, hoping someone would come closer, someone who might actually listen. Yet every face remained distant, assessing from afar, ready to assume the worst. He tightened his grip just enough to keep Victoria from falling again. He tried to guide her toward a lit sidewalk where people could see things clearly. But she pulled away, breath drenched in panic, eyes full of old stereotypes and new fear. And then blue and red lights painted the walls. Sirens cut through the night like a judgment passed. Someone had called the police. Aaron's heart dropped, not out of guilt, but out of a lifetime of knowing what came next. For him, the police weren't a promise of fairness. They were a gamble, one where the stakes were always highest for men who looked like him. Two officers stepped out of the car, hands already near their holsters. They didn't rush to help Victoria. They didn't call out to check if she was harmed. Their eyes locked on Aaron first, and stayed there. His chest tightened like a fist. Victoria tried to speak, but the words stumbled out, slurred and fragmented by alcohol. What little she managed to express only fueled the officers' growing assumption. They stepped closer, their boots heavy on the pavement. The street, once empty, began filling with quiet spectators, shadows waiting for a narrative to take shape. To the police, it already had. Aaron's mind raced. Every instinct told him to stay calm, stay still, stay alive. He raised his hand slowly, the gesture of someone who has rehearsed survival more times than introductions. He wanted to shout that he was helping, that he saved her from falling, from hurting herself, but his voice felt like a match near gasoline. One wrong tone could ignite everything. Victoria tried to stand again, but the pain in her ankle sent her crashing to the ground. Her cry of distress echoed. The officers reacted instantly and decisively. Aaron was grabbed. Rough hands clamped his wrists. Cold metal bit into his skin. It happened fast, too fast for truth to enter the scene. The weight of injustice slammed into him more complex than any force on earth. He tried to remain steady, breathing through fear, but inside his mind a storm surged. I did everything right. Why am I being punished for caring? Victoria, dizzy and overwhelmed, pointed toward him, not because she remembered a threat, but because fear needed a target. And Aaron was the easiest one. Neighbors watched. Phones recorded, rumors formed at the speed of assumption. The officers didn't ask him anything meaningful. They didn't look at the situation from any angle other than the one that fit their bias. A well-dressed white woman. A black man in the dark. A scene shaped by fear, not fact. Victoria's assistant arrived minutes later, alerted by a security app on her phone that tracked the CEO's ride. She ran to her boss's side, comforting her while glaring at Aaron like she'd caught a criminal red-handed. She whispered to the police, and in those hushed tones, reputations rewrote reality. Her fear-filled interpretation became the official story before any truth was collected. The blame had already found its mark. Aaron's breath came quicker. His mind struggled to find stability in a world tilting against him. He remembered every lesson his mother taught him about surviving encounters like this. Stay polite, stay calm, stay alive. But calm didn't protect dignity. Calm didn't stop stereotypes. Calm didn't erase the fear others chose to feel. What made everything worse was the silence, his silence. He wanted to speak. He tried to defend himself. But every word stuck in his throat, not from guilt, but from terror of being misunderstood. He was placed into the back of the police car, the door slamming with the finality of a verdict. From that angle, through the smudged glass, he saw Victoria being helped into another vehicle. She wasn't gone, but her fading presence felt like a sentence. The officers said this was a precaution, that he would be questioned. But precaution felt like punishment when you were treated like danger. The drive to the station was quiet. Too quiet. Aaron's reflection stared back at him, eyes full of disbelief. He replayed every moment, searching for a mistake, but he only found kindness punished by fear. When they arrived, fluorescent lights washed the room in cold judgment. Officers whispered to one another, their stares not curious but convinced. Their silence was a wall he couldn't climb. He was put in a holding room, concrete metal, no warmth anywhere. Time passed slowly. Minutes dragged like hours. Every second fed the fear that this would follow him forever. Meanwhile, Victoria's assistant was busy sculpting a narrative, one that erased nuance, erased uncertainty, erased Aaron's help. Her protective instincts for her boss fueled a dangerous lie, that Victoria wasn't alone because she was drunk, but because she was in danger. Danger with a name. Hours later, a new officer entered. This one carried paperwork. Notepads full. Expressions set like stone. He asked questions, but the tone revealed the answers he had already chosen. Every detail Aaron offered felt twisted in real time. Aaron tried to explain the truth, that he stopped to help, that he didn't want anything from her, that he made sure she wouldn't get hurt. But his voice cracked with fear. His calmness wasn't calm, it was a survival instinct. The officer's pen didn't capture any of that. Soon, a lawyer entered, not for Aaron, but for Victoria. He didn't know that the story outside the station was growing louder than the truth inside. Headlines were forming. Social media was reacting. Speculation was spreading like fire through tinder. A drunk CEO helped by a black man is not what they wanted to believe. CEO endangered by strange man at night was the version they chose. And every share, every rumor, every whisper hardened into something that looked like fact. As dawn approached, the room chilled deeper. The officer stepped out, leaving him alone, isolated with fear that tightened like a noose around his future. He thought of his mother, how she once told him. Doing the right thing doesn't always mean the world will see it that way. He always believed she meant rare moments. Not his entire life. His job. His freedom. His reputation. All felt like they were dissolving before his eyes. He was eventually released from that first holding, pending further investigation, words that sounded like temporary relief but carried a shadow of doom. He walked out into the gray morning light, his body numb, his mind spinning. But the world outside wasn't the same world he had left hours ago. Eyes followed him differently, whispers trailed behind him. His inbox is filled with meeting notices from his job. There was a suspension document waiting for him, pending the outcome of this incident. A building he had helped maintain now saw him as a liability. Pictures taken by strangers that night flooded social networks, none showing the part where he prevented her from falling, none showing his gentle caution, none showing his intent. Only moments of proximity are easily painted as something sinister. Victoria did not correct the story. She did not defend him. Whether from shame, fear, or self-preservation, she allowed the lie to grow teeth. Within a day, he went from invisible to infamous. His neighbors kept their doors slightly shut when they waved. Friends avoided eye contact. Even those who believed him could not stop the tide of rumor. The cruelest part was that he didn't hate her, not even then. He only wondered how a moment of kindness turned into a battle for his life. But the rising action wasn't done with him. It was only the beginning. Because influential people protect themselves. And when a straightforward narrative is easier to digest than the complicated truth, innocence is disposable. Aaron had become the perfect villain for their story. Rumors of a physical struggle surfaced. Suddenly, there were claims he grabbed her aggressively, fabrications wrapped in fear. Security footage from the area came into question. Select clips leaked to the media, taken out of context, showing only what they wanted the world to see. His lawyer, one appointed, overworked and underfunded, warned him things might get worse before they got better. And they did. Days later, he received a letter. An official notice. Victoria was filing a case, not yet entirely criminal, but with enough weight to break him. The rising action crested like a wave preparing to crash. He was no longer just scared. He was furious. But that fury wasn't fire. It was cold. Deep. Quiet. The kind of fury that grows only in those who know they are drowning while others watch, and choose not to help. The world had chosen the story. And the climax was coming. Aaron wasn't sure if he would survive it, or who he would become on the other side. But one thing was sure. He had saved a life. And now, he must fight for his own. The world around him shrank into sharp, terrifying focus. The officers' flashlights were blinding, white beams slicing through the dark like accusations. His feet were planted on the cold pavement, but he felt like he was falling, his chest tightening as if fear itself had hands wrapped around his lungs. "Don't move!" One of them barked again, louder, angrier, as if he'd already committed a crime just by breathing. He raised his hand slowly, palms trembling in the air. His backpack hung from one shoulder, slipping down. "I am just going home," he stammered, voice breaking through the dry ache in his throat. But they didn't care. To them, this wasn't a kid. He wasn't a student. He wasn't someone's son. He was a threat. A suspect. A target. "Why are you out this late?" Another officer stepped closer, hand hovering over the holster of his gun like he couldn't wait to use it. "I was at the youth center. I have my ID, it's in my bag," he whispered, tears already forming, though he didn't want them to. "Tears made you look scared. Tears made you look guilty. Don't reach for anything," came the immediate scream. He froze again. His heart felt like it tried to break through his ribs. The flashing red and blue lights washed over the neighborhood like a warning. Stay inside, stay quiet, stay invisible. A few curtains cracked open in nearby windows, silhouettes watching, whispering, and not helping. Nobody wanted to be next. The boy swallowed hard, his voice barely a thread. "Please. I want to call my mom." The officer closest lowered his voice, swagger dripping off each word. "Oh, you'll be making a call, if you make it out of this." A cruel smirk. Those words sank into him like knives. He didn't understand. He had done everything right. He kept his grades up. He kept his head down. His mother always said, "If they stop you, be polite. Be calm. Come home safe." He was trying. God, he was trying. But he could see in their eyes, calm didn't matter. Right now, he was guilty of existing. The officer circled him like a predator. "Why were you running?" "I wasn't," he replied. But his voice shook. Fear always sounded like lies. "Don't you dare lie to me," the officer shouted, lunging forward and grabbing his hoodie. The fabric tightened around his neck, choking him. His toes barely touched the ground as the officer slammed him against the patrol car. His cheek scraped metal. His eyes widened. "I'm not lying," he gasped between ragged breaths. It didn't matter. Truth never mattered here. They called for backup. More cars arrived. More lights. More eyes judging, assuming, condemning. His backpack finally slipped off his shoulder and hit the pavement. A textbook spilled out, the one he needed for a school project due Monday. On the cover, a faded sticker. "Dream big." One officer kicked the book aside with disgust. "Search it, he ordered. Gloved hands ripped open the zippers. Dumped everything. His folders. His inhaler. A crumpled note from his little sister wishing him good luck on his presentation. Each piece of his life was thrown into the dirt like garbage. Then, something small clinked and rolled. His house keys. There! An officer yelled, eyes wide with false triumph. A weapon. No! He cried, voice cracking. Those are my keys. They're just keys. But the officer already had his baton out. One step back. A hateful grin. The first hit crushed into his side. Air fled his lungs in a sharp gasp. He dropped to his knees. Another hit, his arm. His wrist. He cried out, but the night sirens swallowed the sound. Stop resisting, they shouted. Resisting? He was barely holding onto consciousness. His vision blurred, mixing tears with blood steadily dripping from his lip. He didn't even remember when that split open. A crowd began gathering now, neighbors filming, whispering, some begging the officers to stop. A woman screamed from across the street. He's just a boy. Leave him alone. A boy. Yes. He was a kid. But to them? He was already a statistic they'd justify later. The officer shoved a knee into his back, forcing him to the ground. Gravel dug into his skin. A hot weight pressed against him, suffocating. He heard a loud click, metal tightening around one wrist. Handcuffs. Colder than the night. His mouth pressed against the pavement, and he whispered a word, barely audible. Mom. His tears formed tiny pools beneath his cheek. He wanted her. He wanted home. He tried to wake up from this nightmare. Click. Second cuff locked. There, now you're safe to search, one officer mocked. Safe? He had never felt closer to dying. One cop lifted his head by his hair, making him look straight into the harsh camera lights of a dozen phones. Smile for the internet, he sneered. Humiliation stung sharper than the baton. He begged his voice to come out, to defend himself, but terror stole every syllable. Every breath was a fight. Every second is a punishment. A voice from the crowd trembled. He's bleeding, he can't breathe. He felt the pavement greedily pulling the air from his lungs. His chest rose more slowly. Shallower. Scared. One officer knelt harder, leaning close to hiss into his ear. If you can talk, you can breathe. No. He couldn't. He was fading. He thought of the youth center, the music he'd never finish listening to. The friends are waiting to play soccer tomorrow. The birthday gift he hid in his room for his little sister. The dinner his mom promised. His favorite. The world narrowed into a tiny tunnel of sound. Sirens, yelling. His heartbeat slowing. His thoughts screamed, but his body refused to move. He tried to lift his chest. Nothing. His lungs burned, screaming for air. Black spots swarmed his vision. Someone shouted. You're killing him. Get off him. Feet scraped, a shove, then a sudden shift. The weight lifted. He gasped violently, a ragged inhale clawing its way into him. Voices blurred. Lights streaked. The sky spun. One officer shouted into his radio. Another pressed a hand into his bleeding arm, too hard. The pain ripped through him like lightning. He wanted to cry out again, but only a small whimper escaped. He stared at the crowd, at the woman crying into both hands, at the teen his age recording with wide, terrified eyes, wondering if he'd be the next one thrown to the ground. He wasn't alone. But he had never felt more alone. The officer who first grabbed him leaned close again, his breath bitter with anger. You're lucky, he said, voice low, threatening. Next time, you won't be. Next time. Like this was just the beginning of the nightmare. His eyes fluttered as paramedics arrived. They checked his pulse, asked questions he couldn't answer. His words were trapped beneath trauma. They lifted him onto a stretcher, the streetlights spinning above like chaotic stars. Phones stayed recording. The crowd stayed silent, not because they didn't care, but because fear teaches quiet. As the ambulance doors closed, one final sound pierced the air. Mom. Mom, please, his voice cried, a desperate child's plea escaping his broken defenses. But she wasn't there. And nobody knew if he'd ever make it home to her again. The sirens wailed, carrying him into the unknown. He made it out of that night alive, but nothing about him felt the same. The terror, the crushing weight of injustice, the raw humiliation, they weren't something you could wash off. They clung to him, living in the tremor of his hands, in the hollow ache of his chest, in the restless nights where shadows whispered the memory of those officers' hands on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on that street, the sirens, the flashing lights, the glare of a society that saw him first as a threat, not a human being. But survival did not mean silence. It did not mean surrender. In the weeks that followed, the world started to notice, because someone had recorded the confrontation. The shaky footage from a neighbor's phone surfaced, shared across social media, replayed, dissected, and debated. For the first time, people saw the truth, a young boy doing nothing more than existing, facing the consequences of bias, brutality, and fear. The images of him on the pavement, vulnerable and terrified, became a mirror for society, forcing many to confront what they had long ignored. Aaron's story spread quickly, not just because of the horror, but because it resonated. It was more than a single incident, it was an emblem of countless moments that go unreported, unseen, and unpunished. He became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of endurance, courage, and the painful clarity of injustice. Every news cycle that replayed the footage reminded people of the fragile line between perception and reality, between prejudice and truth. For Aaron, it was overwhelming. Suddenly, his private terror became public, a cautionary tale and a rallying cry all at once. And yet, amid the storm, there were glimmers of hope. Community members stepped forward, advocates rallied, and organizations offered legal support and solidarity. Letters, messages, and posts poured in from strangers, people who had faced similar experiences, people who finally saw themselves reflected in his struggle. He realized he wasn't alone. No one should ever feel like their existence is a crime, but when it is treated as such, standing together becomes more than necessary, it becomes urgent. In the quiet moments, Aaron reflected on what had happened. He thought about the officers, the assumptions, the accusations, and the systemic forces that made an ordinary act of kindness feel like a threat. He thought about Victoria, the CEO, and how fear, entitlement, and bias can twist perception. He understood something fundamental. It wasn't just one officer or one woman who failed him. It was the pattern of a society that judged him first and listened later, the implicit rules that decide which lives matter more. He carried that understanding like a scar, a warning, and a fuel for change. Every conversation he had afterwards, every post he shared, every interview he granted became a careful act of education and reflection. He spoke not to punish, but to illuminate, to show that injustice doesn't only live in headlines. It lives in everyday encounters, in decisions made in a split second, in assumptions that have consequences far beyond the moment. But survival also meant reclaiming his life. The bruises faded, the handcuffs were removed, and slowly, he returned to his routines. School, friends, family, fragments of normalcy returned like the cautious light of dawn after a long night. And yet, he was changed. He carried a new awareness of the fragility of safety, the weight of being judged for what you look like rather than who you are. And he had the fire of resilience, a determination that he would not let fear, humiliation, or injustice define him. The incident sparked conversations in places he never expected. Teachers, students, neighbors, and even strangers discussed the video, debating bias, privilege, and the thin line between assumption and truth. Aaron realized that stories like his, painful, raw, shocking, are what awaken empathy, demand reflection, and ultimately drive change. For him, the lesson was personal. Surviving isn't enough. Witnessing, speaking, and refusing to let injustice go unchallenged are what make survival meaningful. He understood that the story didn't end with him walking away from that night. It continued in the messages he received from young people who saw themselves in him, who finally felt recognized, who finally understood that their fear was valid and that their voice mattered. He learned that impact is measured not just in personal recovery but in the ripples a story can create, in communities that choose to act, in hearts that desire to see, and in minds that choose to question long-held assumptions. And so, as he looked back on that night, the darkness, the violence, the unfairness, he also saw the light that followed. Not a perfect light. Not a world suddenly fair. But light enough to hold on to hope, to demand accountability, and to inspire others to stand firm when the world misunderstands them. Because truth, though often delayed, has a way of piercing the loudest noise. Aaron's life was forever altered, but not broken. He emerged from the ordeal with a new perspective, one sharpened by fear but guided by courage. He knew now that acts of kindness, no matter how ordinary, could be reframed as danger by those unwilling to confront bias. He also knew that standing firm, even when misjudged, could spark awareness and change. In his heart, he carried both the weight of injustice and the responsibility of testimony, a reminder that silence only empowers prejudice. As the screen fades to black and the final images linger in the mind, the question remains, how many more times must this happen before society truly sees the impact of bias? How many moments of terror, humiliation, and misjudgment will continue to shape young lives until we demand accountability, empathy, and justice? Aaron's story is not unique. It is the story of countless children, teenagers, and adults who live under the shadow of prejudice every day, waiting, hoping, surviving. And if we choose to watch, reflect, and act, perhaps his struggle will ignite a change larger than one boy's fear, one viral video, or one fleeting headline. Maybe it will remind us that every life deserves recognition, dignity, and protection. Because injustice thrives when we look away. Because change begins when we choose to see. And because no act of courage, no matter how ordinary, should ever be punished with fear. Share this story. Talk about it. Stand up when someone else is judged before being understood. The question isn't whether injustice exists, it's what will you do when you see it next?